So here's how the environment is supposed to work. This first part is a quick review from elementary school, but please stick with me because that part is very short and I promise you'll learn something when I start comparing that to what we're doing. The two main characters in the environment are plants and animals. Plants take in fertilizer from the ground and carbon dioxide from the air. Once it absorbs the carbon dioxide, the plant just separates it, retaining the carbon and emitting the oxygen back into the air. Then there are animals. They take in food, which is plants and sometimes other animals, and oxygen from the air. Once they absorb it, they basically just use the oxygen to turn the food into energy and then put out carbon dioxide and fertilizer. It's called a symbiotic ecosystem. There are obviously a lot of other processes that make up the environment, for example the water cycle, and random things like when plants and animals die and their remains end up getting covered and pushed deep underground where they stop participating in this loop. But this part up top is arguably the most important part of the environment and the one that society is screwing up the most. See, we used to live this way for a very long time and it worked fine, but eventually we figured out that if you take the kind of plants that produce the most food, that's supposed to be corn, and plant a bunch of them together, that's a much more efficient way of getting food than just hunting and gathering. But this started an obsession with efficiency. Pretty soon we were planting huge fields of only one type of crop and keeping animals out of the fields to stop them from eating our food. But after a couple decades of this, we would find that the plants stopped growing on the land because all the fertilizer the plants needed was used up and wasn't being replenished like it should have been. But no worries, we just moved on to another plot of land. This worked well for a long time until finally all of the land in entire regions got used up and turned barren. That's why the Middle East is sometimes referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It's not meant ironically. It's because that used to be a very fertile land until centuries of agriculture turned it to desert. But being as industrious as we are, humans eventually figured out what was going on and that the crops needed fertilizer. But recently, rather than just going back to the fertilization process nature gave us, we've come up with a more efficient way to fertilize. Today, the vast majority of crops are fertilized with chemical fertilizer, most of which is made from natural gas or coal, and requires a lot of energy to produce, and we get most of our energy by burning other fossil fuels. And what about those animals? Well, humans seem to have figured out that much like growing crops, growing livestock like cattle can be done more efficiently in a monoculture, which is when you have a high concentration of one species of plant or animal crammed into an area. I can't draw cows very easily. We've also found that cattle grow more efficiently by feeding them corn instead of grass, which is what they're supposed to eat. But what's the harm in that? The harm comes from the fact that cows are supposed to eat grass, and things go wrong when they don't. Like how corn-fed cattle have a much higher incidence of E. coli disease, or how beef-fed cattle have a high incidence of mad cow disease, both of which are diseases that can be passed on to us when we eat their meat. And much of this is done in those monocultures, which are horrible for the environment in other ways, like how having high concentrations of a single species in an area makes them much more susceptible to disease, regardless of what we feed them. So we have to use tons of herbicides and pesticides on our crops, and antibiotics on our livestock, which in turn is causing weeds and bugs to become resistant to herbicides and pesticides, and causing bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics. And we're also messing with the environment in other ways. How do we get all of that feed to the animals in the feedlots? We truck it there. And how do we get all of that food to people all over the country? We truck it there. And how do we get ourselves all over the place rather than walking like we used to with the natural model? We drive and fly ourselves all over the place. And how do we power all of the machines and technology that now seems necessary for modern life? With electricity, most of which comes from burning fossil fuels, rather than just living a simpler life like we used to with the natural model. And what do all of these answers have in common? The burning of fossil fuels. Those buried plants and animals I mentioned earlier, turns out that with a lot of heat and pressure and time, plants like algae and animals like plankton turn into fossil fuel, which we dig and pump out of the ground and burn, releasing all of their stored carbon into the air. That natural little exchange between plants and animals is pretty much all that is supposed to affect the levels of carbon dioxide in the air. But now we're on our way to doubling the historic concentration of carbon dioxide in the air if we don't change our ways. And if you don't think that's going to affect the environment, it's an understandable point of view. But you really need to watch this video. Please. So basically the problem is that we've built up this human environment all around us and seem to have forgotten that our environment still exists within the natural environment and is straying too far from that natural model. The way we grow food and process it is straying so far from the natural food that we're supposed to eat. And the way we get around by vehicle instead of exercising like we're supposed to, together these are causing serious health problems for us. And the way we're burning fossil fuels that are supposed to be stored underground is throwing off the fragile balance of our atmosphere and causing all of those horrible feedback loops that are addressed in this video. But the good news is that there's a relatively easy fix. You may have noticed how I kept emphasizing the word efficiently when I was talking about the industrial food process. That's because it really only seems like those practices are more efficient. Take cattle feed, for example. Yes, cattle will get bigger and grow faster if they're fed on corn instead of grass, so it seems more efficient. But to raise corn-fed cattle, you first have to raise the corn, planting and harvesting it with huge machines, fertilizing it with chemical fertilizer, which you also have to produce, trucking the corn to the feedlots, convincing the cattle to eat something they're not supposed to eat by slathering it in corn syrup, much the same way we're convinced to eat industrial food, and which requires growing and processing more corn. You have to deal with all of the manure that the cattle produce, which becomes toxic in such high concentrations, and inject them with antibiotics to keep them from getting sick in that overpopulated environment. On the other hand, to raise grass-fed cattle, all you have to do is leave them to their own devices in a pasture. So which way is really more efficient? That's the moral of the story. I'm not saying that we need to go back to living the way people were thousands of years ago. We just need to learn from the natural model and apply that to modern life. We don't need to stop eating food just because most of it is produced in a way that's harming the environment. We just need to start producing it in ways that reflect the natural model, like farmers markets and starting a garden to produce some of your own food. We don't need to give up technology just because it uses electricity. We just need to generate electricity in a way that doesn't put tons of carbon dioxide in the air, or look for ways to reduce our energy consumption. In the end, we just need to learn from nature and from our own past mistakes and spread that knowledge around. A great way to start would be by sharing this video. Thanks. I'm not draw this bunny right to save my life.